Montana Territory, December 1883. Snow whipped east across the Bitterroot Range as Gideon Dorsey leaned into the wind, reins tight in his gloved hands, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. He had seen winters worse than this, but not many. The sky was low and gray, the kind that promised more snow before dusk. His mare, a steady dun named Molly, snorted through the cold, her hooves crunching over the frozen trail. He almost missed her. At first, it looked like a heap of snow and cloth by the side of the trail. But something in the shape made him pull the reins. He jumped down, boots sinking into the drift, and knelt. She was barely conscious, cheeks raw from cold, lips blue. The hem of her white dress was crusted with ice, one slipper missing. A torn veil clung to her hair. She looked like a ghost. "Hey," Gideon said, tugging off his glove and pressing 2 fingers to her throat, a pulse faint but there. "You're not dying out here, not today." He pulled off his coat and wrapped it around her, then scooped her into his arms. She barely stirred. Her skin was cold as creek water in spring. He got her on the saddle in front of him, holding her close as he turned Molly toward his cabin, 5 miles deeper into the timber. By the time they reached the small pine and stone cabin, the wind had picked up. Gideon kicked the door open, carried her inside, and shut out the storm. He lowered her onto the cot by the fire and went to work, boots off, wet dress peeled away, thick wool blankets layered over her. He stoked the fire higher, hands moving fast but careful. She was shaking now, which was better than still. Her eyes blinked open as he pressed a tin mug of warmed brandy to her lips. "Easy now," he said. "Drink that. You're safe." She coughed, drank a little, then looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Where am I? My cabin. You were half dead on the trail." "Snow would have covered you by nightfall. Did you?" Her voice cracked. "Did you see a horse, a black one?" "No horse, just you." She stared at the fire for a moment, then whispered, "Good." Gideon sat back on his heels. "You want to tell me your name?" She hesitated. He nodded once. "All right." "No need right now. You warm enough." She nodded slightly, then whispered, "Keziah." He gave her a quick smile. "Gideon Dorsey." She let her eyes close again. He stayed near the fire all night, stoking it, keeping watch. She slept hard, the kind of sleep that comes after running from something too long. By morning, the storm had buried the trail in snow. Keziah woke weak but better, sitting up slowly beneath the blankets. "Thank you," she said. "Do not thank me yet. You caught a chill and were snowed in." She looked around the one-room cabin, rough plank walls, shelves of canned goods, a rifle over the door. "This place is quiet, been that way a while." She looked at him then, really looked. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, maybe 30, with a short beard and steady eyes that did not ask questions he was not ready to hear answers to. Keziah's voice was soft. "I ran from my wedding." He did not blink. "I gathered that." She looked down at her hands. "My father owns half of Coldwater. Henry Mather, banker, you heard of him." Gideon leaned back against the table, arms crossed. "I have. He is not the sort of man people say no to. No, he tried to marry me to Mr. Ellsworth, twice my age, his business partner." She clenched her jaw. "I could not do it. You picked a hell of a time to run." "I waited until the carriage was ready, slipped out the back, took a horse from the stable. I thought I could reach Missoula before nightfall, but the horse spooked. You nearly died." She looked up. "But you saved me." He nodded once. "I did." There was a long silence. The wind howled outside. Inside, the fire cracked and something shifted between them, something quiet but solid. Over the next few days, the snow kept falling, piling high outside the windows. They moved around each other in careful rhythms. Gideon cooked. Keziah cleaned what she could, wrapped in one of his old shirts and thick socks. She watched him chop wood, fix the latch on the door, brush down the horse. He never asked about her life, and she never asked about his. But something unspoken began to build. One morning she asked, "Why do you live out here alone?" Gideon looked up from where he was sharpening a knife. "Too many people in town, too many questions." "Are you running from something?" He set the knife down. "No. Just done chasing things that never wanted me back." She watched him a long moment. "Well, now you have company." He looked at her. "That I do." That night the storm finally broke. Stars shone down on the snow-covered pines. Inside the cabin, Keziah stood by the fire, her hair loose, cheeks pink from warmth. Gideon brought her a mug of tea, their fingers brushing. She looked up at him. "What happens next?" He looked her in the eyes. "You tell me." She set the mug down and stepped closer. Her voice shook. "I should be afraid, but I am not with you." "I would never hurt you," he said. "I know." He reached up, brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You are brave, Keziah Mather. So are you, Gideon Dorsey." And then, under the soft flicker of firelight, she leaned in and kissed him. It was not rushed. It was quiet and sure and real. Outside, the forest stood still beneath the moon. Inside, two people who had run from different things found something worth staying for. The morning broke with a brittle blue sky, the kind that came after days buried under cloud. A crust of ice clung to the windows. Gideon rose early, careful not to wake her. He stepped outside, boots sinking into the snow's hardened skin, and carried in more wood, breath rising in white puffs. The silence of the forest pressed close, broken only by an occasional groan of trees under weight. Inside, Keziah had stirred. She stood barefoot on the braided rug, wrapped in the quilt she'd slept under, watching him as he shook the snow from his coat. "I can help with something," she said, her voice low but clear. "You just got your strength back. I need to move." "Sitting still makes me feel like I'm waiting to be caught." Gideon hung his coat and nodded toward the shelves. "There's flour, dried apples, lard." "You know how to bake." "I wasn't raised to be useless." She gathered ingredients with practiced hands, sleeves rolled, hair tied back with a strip of cloth. He started mending a snowshoe by the hearth, listening to her movements, the sift of flour, the scrape of tin. They worked in tandem without speaking for a while, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. After a time, she said, "You ever been married?" He didn't look up. "No, came close once, before the war." "What happened?" "She married someone else while I was gone." She set the mixing bowl down. "Did you love her?" "I thought I did. Hard to say now. We were young, I wore a uniform, she wore ribbons, that was most of it." Keziah leaned back against the table, arms crossed. "Do you regret not settling down?" "I regret things I did, not where I ended up." She studied him but didn't press. Later, they ate biscuits warm from the fire, steam rising from the apple preserves she'd stirred together. Her hands were red from washing, the skin around her knuckles raw. "I'll need to go to town soon," he said between bites. "We're running low on lamp oil and salt." She hesitated. "What will you tell them?" "That I've got company at the cabin. They'll ask more than that. Then I'll say you're none of their concern. You could say I was your cousin. They know I haven't got one." Her gaze held his. "What if someone recognizes me?" "I'll deal with it if they do." She was quiet for a long time, then said softly, "I don't want to go back." "You don't have to. My father won't stop looking." "Not when he's paid for everything down to the embroidery on the hem." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "If he comes here, I'll stand between you and him." "That's not just words." "I believe you." Snow began to fall again that afternoon, light flakes drifting like ash through the pines. Gideon brought in the mare and brushed her down in the lean-to, checking her legs for strain. He'd taught Keziah how to stitch a patch into the toe of his boot, and she worked on it beside the fire, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. That night, she said, "I keep remembering the way they all looked at me like I was a parcel being passed from one man to another. Like my thoughts didn't matter." He sat down across from her. "They don't get to look at you anymore. I used to think I had no choice, that it was just the way things were. It's not." She nodded once, slow. "You think people can really live different than how they were raised. I think it depends on what they're willing to lose." She looked down at her hands. "I already lost everything I was supposed to want, and found something better. I don't know what this is yet." "It's not a trade," he said. "You don't owe me anything." "I know." She lifted her eyes to his, "But I'd like to stay anyway." He stood crossed to her and offered his hand. She rose, took it, and let him guide her to his side. There was no rush in the way she leaned into him, no fear in the way her fingers laced with his. Outside, the wind had slowed to a whisper. The trees stood silent, as if listening. Inside the cabin, warmth held steady, and two people who had been shaped by solitude began to learn the shape of something shared. By the second week, the snow had hardened into glittering crust, and the forest wore silence like a second skin. Keziah had taken to walking the path between the cabin and the lean-to each morning, her boots crunching over the packed ground Gideon had cleared. She moved with more assurance now, shoulders no longer held tight, her eyes less guarded. She found Gideon by the fence line, hammering a split rail back into place where the weight of the snow had bowed it. His coat was dusted with frost, and the morning sun caught in the lines around his eyes. "Did you build this place yourself?" she asked, leaning against the post beside him. "Every board. Took 2 summers." She rested her cheek against the cold wood. "You ever wish you'd done it somewhere else?" He shook his head. "The land here's honest, doesn't give more than it can spare, doesn't pretend to." Keziah was quiet a moment. "I never learned how to read a map." "My father said there was no need, said I'd never go anywhere worth getting lost in. Seems to me you made it plenty far. I want to learn. Maps, names of trees, where the sun sets in winter, all of it." He wiped his hands on a rag and handed her the hammer. "Then we'll start with a new rail," she laughed. The sound surprised even to her. "You want me to hammer that in? I want you to try." Her first strike rang wide. He showed her how to angle her wrist, how to feel the weight of the tool in her palm. The second hit landed true, and she beamed at him, cheeks flushed with cold. That night, she sat cross-legged on the floor with a battered atlas spread beside her and a candle burning low. Gideon pointed out the mountain ranges, the rivers that threaded through the valleys. She traced each name with her finger. "Where were you born?" she asked. "Near Columbia, Missouri. Farm boy turned soldier, then nothing for a long while." Keziah nodded slowly. "I was born in a house with velvet curtains and 3 parlors. But none of it ever felt like mine. You ever want to go back there?" She looked up at him, her voice steady. "No, I want to build something from the beginning, even if it's small." The wind picked up outside, rattling the door hinges. Gideon pulled another blanket from the chest and draped it over her shoulders. "You can stay as long as you want," he said. "I want more than to stay," she said, eyes on the map. "I want to belong." He crouched beside her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Then we'll make a place where you do." The next day, Gideon rode to town. Keziah watched him disappear beyond the trees, her hands buried in the folds of her skirt. She spent the hours splitting kindling, then mending the lining of his spare coat with thread pulled from her old dress hem. She boiled beans and bacon, and when dusk settled, she lit the lantern and waited. He returned after dark, his horse lathered and tired. He unpacked supplies from the saddlebag: salt, lamp oil, flour, a packet of letters tied with string. "They've posted a reward," he said quietly as he unsaddled the mare. "For a missing young woman named Keziah Mather, $500. She didn't flinch. "Did anyone see you?" Sheriff asked if I'd been up the ridge lately. I said I hadn't seen a soul. She stepped closer, eyes steady. "If they come looking, they won't find what they're after." She reached for his hand. "I don't want you caught in this." He looked down at her fingers wrapped around his. "I'm not caught, I'm choosing." She pressed her forehead to his chest, and he folded his arms around her. The fire crackled behind them, and outside, snow began to fall again, soft, steady, and without threat. Later, after supper, she pulled a piece of muslin from the small trunk by the door and began stitching a square. A pine tree, crooked but proud, took shape beneath her needle. "What's that for?" he asked, watching from his chair. "A quilt. I want to sew one that's only mine. From here." He nodded, then added, "You'll need more cloth. I'll find a way." He rose, crossed to the hearth, and pulled a bundle from the cupboard. Inside were scraps of wool, flannel, and a swatch of his old shirt. "I was saving these for nothing in particular," he said. She took them from his hands, smiling. "Now there'll be something." They sat together as the night deepened, her stitches slow and careful, his knife whittling a spoon from a chunk of pine. No words passed between them for a long while, but something deeper did: a rhythm, a trust born not of grand gestures but of quiet, consistent care. The world outside was wide and unwelcome. But inside the cabin, with the snow pressing soft against the walls and the fire burning low, Keziah and Gideon had begun to carve out a belonging that no one could take. The days stretched longer after the last snowfall, light lingering past supper as the trees shed their burden inch by inch. Keziah had taken to keeping a small ledger by the window where she marked each day with a pencil stub, not out of dread, but to prove, perhaps only to herself, that she was still choosing this life. Gideon came back early one afternoon from checking the snares down in the draw, a small brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. His sleeves were rolled, forearms streaked with dirt. She watched him from where she sat stringing beads into the hem of a curtain she was making from a worn feed sack. "You ever hunt for more than feeding yourself?" she asked without looking up. He set the rabbits on the table. "Trapped otter once for their pelts, sold them to a man passing through from Butt, didn't like how it felt. Why, too much taking. Not enough giving back." She tied off the last bead and set the cloth aside. "You ever think about what it might have been like if we'd met in town? Not like this." He turned to the stove, setting a kettle over the flame before answering. "I wouldn't have spoken to you. Not if you were walking with your father. I might have noticed you, probably would have wondered what you did for work. Would have told you nothing you'd believe." She crossed to the table and ran her thumb along the edge of one of the rabbit's ears. "I keep trying to picture what my life would be if I hadn't left. It's like looking through a window into a house that doesn't belong to me." He poured water into the basin, steam rising. "And this place feels like a door I opened myself." Gideon washed his hands and dried them on a cloth hung by the stove. "You've been sewing more than ever. I like making things that stay made." He reached for the ledger. "You've filled 2 pages. I like the quiet of it." She paused. "Do you think it's foolish, counting days like they mean something? They mean what you give them." She was quiet a moment, then said, "I used to think time was something that just happened to me. Now I feel like I'm shaping it." That evening, Gideon worked on weatherproofing the cabin's back wall, patching gaps with pitch and moss. Keziah brought him a tin of stew and lingered, watching the way he pressed the mixture into the cracks with deliberate care. "Was your father like you?" she asked. He wiped his hands on his trousers. "He was louder, never sat still. But he taught me how to mend what was broken before throwing it away, said that's how you keep a farm alive. Mine never fixed anything with his own hands. He'd pay someone else to do it, then act like it cost him something. You don't talk about your mother. She died when I was 10, pneumonia. After that, it was all tutors and table manners. You miss her, not the way people mean when they say that, no. I missed the chance to know who she really was." They walked back together through the trees, the last light turning the snow to copper. Keziah paused to cup her hands around a cluster of frost-bitten berries clinging to a low bush. "These shouldn't still be here," she said. "They're stubborn. Maybe that's enough." At the cabin, she took out a strip of blue calico and began sewing it into the quilt she'd started. Gideon watched from the doorway, boots in his hand. "What do the colors mean?" he asked. "Blues for leaving, reds for staying. Greens for what isn't known yet." He crossed to kneel beside her. "What about this?" he asked, touching a square of dark brown. "That's for the days I thought I was forgotten." She looked over at him. "And this?" she asked, pointing to a golden scrap stitched tight at the corner. He met her eyes. "Hope, maybe." Her hand found his, fingers lacing slow and sure. "I think I'd like to start a garden. We'll need to clear more ground come spring. I want to grow something that feeds us. Something I can pull from the dirt and know I did that. I'll help you." She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. For a long while they sat like that, the quilt forgotten in her lap, the fire behind them quiet and steady. Outside, the snow melted in soft rivulets down the slope. Inside, the shape of a life began to settle around them, not just survival, not just shelter, but something that grew from the shared act of building, something that would last. The first signs of thaw came quietly, sap rising in the pines, water trickling beneath snow banks, the air holding a softness that hadn't been there before. Keziah stepped outside barefoot one morning, toes curling into damp dirt where the snow had receded by the eastern slope. She stood still, breathing in the scent of moss and wet bark, the world slowly stirring around her. Inside, Gideon had laid out a short-handled spade, a seed bag stitched from canvas, and a coil of hemp string. He watched her through the open door, her shift brushing against her knees, hair loose and wind touched. "I reckon the ground's near ready," he said as she stepped back inside. "I want to plant beans first," she said. "They're stubborn. They climb even when there's nothing to hold onto." He nodded, folding the seed bag shut. "We'll stake rows after breakfast." They worked side by side, clearing rock and root, his hands calloused and sure, hers blistered but steady. By midday, the first furrow ran straight and clean. She pressed seeds into the soil with the pad of her thumb, like setting something precious into the earth. Later, she found him repairing a broken hinge on the lean-to door, his shirt damp with sweat. She knelt with a tin of salve, dabbing his scraped knuckles without asking. "You get letters from anyone?" she asked as she worked. "No kin left to write," he said. "You? My cousin wrote me once, after Mama passed, said I should be grateful for everything Papa gave me. I never wrote back." He shifted, watching her. "I can ride to Missoula next week. There's a traveling judge there. If you want us to be seen proper in the eyes of the law," her hands stilled. "You do that." "I would." She leaned back on her heels. "I don't want to be Miss Mather anymore." "You don't have to be." She looked down at his hand, then back at his face. "Then yes, let's do it." They packed provisions and rode out 2 mornings later, the mare carrying them both. The trail was passable now, though muddy in places, and they took it slow, camped once beneath the stars, her head resting against his shoulder, blanket tucked around them both. In Missoula, they paid $3 to the judge and stood beneath a cottonwood sapling behind the courthouse. The vows were plain, the man's words dry, but Keziah met Gideon's eyes and saw nothing in the world but rightness. That night, they stayed in a room above the butcher's shop. She wore a dark blue dress she'd sewn from scavenged cloth, and he had pressed his one good shirt. He poured her a cup of cider, then sat beside her on the narrow bed. "You sure?" he asked. "This life, it'll never be easy." "I don't need easy," she said. "Just true." He kissed her then, slow and without urgency, as if they had all the time in the world, which, as it turned out, they did. They returned to the cabin with spring rising around them. She planted squash and turnips. He added support beams to the roof. Their days took shape in shared silence and soft laughter, in learning the shape of each other's habits, how she always hummed when she chopped onions, how he never let the fire die before dawn. One afternoon, she brought out the finished quilt. She'd stitched a single gold square into the center and surrounded it with uneven rows of color, each piece told without explanation. She laid it across their bed and stepped back, hands on her hips. "You made that whole thing by hand," Gideon said behind her. "Back in December, you couldn't hold a needle straight." "I taught myself," she said. "Like I taught myself how to stay." He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You didn't just stay, you built something." They slept under that quilt every night after. Through the long summer, the garden flourished, and Keziah traded extra beans in town for a bar of soap and a tin of pepper. No one asked where she came from. No one needed to. By autumn, the fence was mended, the roof tight, and the shelves full. Gideon carved her a set of spoons, each with a different flower etched into the handle. She embroidered their initials into the curtain hem, a small thing, but it made her smile. One evening, as the fire burned low and the air turned sharp again, Keziah sat with her feet tucked beneath her on the bench, mending a tear in Gideon's coat. "Do you ever miss the years you lost?" she asked. He closed the ledger, setting it aside. "Not anymore." "Not since you." She reached for his hand, threading their fingers together. "I wonder what my mother would say if she saw me now. She'd say you found your own way. That's worth more than any inheritance." Keziah kissed his knuckles, her voice quiet. "I used to think I had to be saved. Now I know I just needed space to become." "You became someone strong," he said. "Someone who made this place more than just walls." The fire crackled between them, warm against the windows. Beyond the glass, the forest stood steady. Snow would come again, and the days would shorten. But they'd seen each other through the storm once, and they'd do it again, side by side. And so they did. Years passed, measured not in calendars but in harvests, in quiet mornings spent side by side, and in the quilt that grew worn from use but never frayed. The cabin stood through every winter, held fast by the weight of 2 lives that had chosen each other freely, fully, and without regret. And neither Keziah nor Gideon ever walked alone again.